So I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's my first time at Breakthrough Convention. So a little bit about me and Transform, and then I want to talk about really why the drug war has been so resilient. But firstly, I was a drugs counsellor in the criminal justice system, working with people in prison and on probation, heavy-end heroin and crack users in the main. And that was a real eye-opener, because what is treated as fairly normal in the world in terms of criminalising people with significant problems, and I'll go into a little bit about what those problems were and are. I came into this work primarily on a civil liberties tip. I'm also a recreational drug user, and it was that disturbed me. It seemed like a significant infringement of the state into my privacy. That was the real concern for me. But working with people in the criminal justice system, the issues that they faced were nothing compared to mine as a middle class drug user. These were mainly working class people who had suffered significant abuse and neglect. They generally came from poor backgrounds. Their parents were quite often dependent drug users. They suffered unresolved bereavements. Most of them had been in care. And given that was the kind of damage that these people were symptomatically using heroin and crack for, the idea of beating them with the criminal justice system in order to alleviate their pain and rehabilitate them was just, for me, totally abhorrent. So these combination of issues led me to set up Transform. So that combination of civil liberties and social justice really were the things that pushed me into this. By the way, I'd like to make this interactive as I go along. If there's anything that I say that you're confused by or want to ask a question, just stick your hand up as we go along. We are now 20 years into a campaign. Transform is one of the foremost organisations in the world now, actually, critiquing the war on drugs and offering a very clear description of what a legally regulated system would look like. And it's fairly simple. There are only 4 ways of dealing with drugs. You either prohibit them, you prescribe them, you dispense them from pharmacies, or you sell them under licence. 3 of those ways are called government regulation, and the other one is called gifting it to gangsters and unregulated dealers, and creates all the panoply of problems that occur not only in the UK, but right around the world, from Mexico to Afghanistan, Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, Honduras, Costa Rica, Burma. I mean, really, it is a global catastrophe of stunning proportions that has been created by us. And it's been created by us because drugs have been identified as an existential threat to humankind. It's very clear that that's been done because it's actually written into the Single Convention of 1961. It identifies drug abuse, that's their term, as a threat to the health and welfare of mankind. Sadly, women clearly don't suffer, it's men. So humankind is identified as being under an existential threat as a result of these drugs both existing, being used, misused, supplied and produced. Having identified them as a threat, prohibition is then put in place to eradicate, neutralise, basically get rid of the problem. And up until fairly recently, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime has described its work as creating a drug-free world. Hello? But somehow tobacco and alcohol and prescribed drugs are excluded from that, and clearly drugs are winning in the war on drugs. So what I want to talk about is given that the global prohibition is such a catastrophe and has nothing to offer citizens, really, although I'll come to a little bit about where it does later, it's predominantly a catastrophic negative program. Why is it so resilient and persistent? But also a look at how we might get out of it. So these are some ideas of mine that I've been playing with for a while. Feedback is welcomed. I do not speak the truth with capital T, capital T. I speak my own machinations from thinking about this obsessively for 20 years. So I began exploring this in terms of why does this continue? This madness continue? If it is clearly so awful. Well, the question is, who might it be beneficial for? That's where I started from. And what I wanted to do was start by looking at what are the key forces that hold things in place generally on planet Earth. And I came up with 5 key forces. The first and broadest is nature. Nature, both in terms of the resources that nature provides, drugs themselves are obviously part of that. But also the threats that nature has. Volcanoes, tsunamis, global warming if we mess things up really badly. We continue to mess things up really badly. So nature is one of the key forces here. The other one is the state. Now I'm going to use Max Weber's definition of the state because I think it's useful for us in terms of focusing what role the state plays here. Max Weber's definition of the state is that it is the geographical authority with a monopoly on legitimate violence. Now you can see then how that plays into the war on drugs and how the state uses the war on drugs to apply violence where and when it wants. And you can begin to see how it might have a major investment in maintaining that opportunity, more of which later. The other one is the government, which, and I was trying to think of a good definition, because there are various definitions of what government is. But it's ostensibly, it seems to me, where it's useful for us, is an interface between the citizenry and the state. Now, I know that works better in some circumstances than others, but that's a kind of working definition that I think is useful and particularly will be useful in terms of looking at what's happening in the US. The last force that has a powerful place in the world is us, human beings. Now, we have the power to vote and we have the power to do a lot of other things. I'm not saying that Homo sapiens is better than all other species on Earth, but we need to keep this kind of bound in some way. So I'm going to stick to citizens as being key here in terms of animal life on Earth. So let me run through why I think that how we can use those 5 forces to look at why the war on drugs continues and also why it might end. So starting from nature, how does the war on drugs, I mean, it's slightly more complex and I haven't given this so much thought, but nature's in an interesting place. Nature obviously gives us those psychoactive substances. So it has it gives us the gift of drugs. But applying a drug war is a major distraction to actually dealing with some of the fundamental issues that relate to looking after planet Earth and indeed the rest of the universe. It seems to me that the greatest threat, a real existential threat that we face at the moment, is climate change. And the drug war is a major, major distraction from that. So in that sense, anything that distracts from actually maintaining planet Earth as a place for people, giraffes, tigers and various other species to live on is dumb in the extreme. Drugs aren't an existential threat. Let's just deal with that. They aren't. Alcohol and tobacco kill an enormous number of people, but they're not judged an existential threat. They're something that capitalism handles really well. to its own ends, and something that is just a challenge that we face globally on a public health basis. But drugs are not an existential threat to humankind. Now, let's come to the state. In terms of a beneficiary of prohibition, the state obviously gains enormous amounts of social control, and in terms of foreign policy, it's enabled the US to go wandering around in whoever's country, region, it happens to want to do so. And it also offers a superb tool for social control domestically. Look at the number of black people who are imprisoned in the US. The US has 5% of the world's population, 25% of its prison population, 40% of whom are there for non-violent drug offences, an enormous number of whom are black. So it works for domestic and foreign social control policies. And look at the way also that Russia and China, as key hegemons, apply the war on drugs narrative, both domestically and abroad. The Russians continually blame Afghan opium for almost all their problems when they have the opportunity to do so. The Chinese have very long memories. The opium wars weren't pretty for them, and the idea of moving towards legalisation is not somewhere that sits happily with them. And clearly a state that wants enormous social control domestically. For capitalism, they don't care where the money comes from, so they're beneficiaries either way. They're going to make money out of legal drugs, they're going to make money out of illegal drugs. HSBC was fined, I think, in 2012 in the US. $881 million worth of Mexican drug money was knowingly laundered through HSBC, and they were fined $1.9 billion for having been caught at it. But that was all that was just what they were caught for. So capitalism will accommodate prohibition and the money that derives from it quite happily. So again, they're beneficiaries. They'd be beneficiaries if it was legalised too, but they're certainly not going to be leading the charge to change. They're okay. Which leaves citizens who are, interestingly, I think both benefactors and beneficiaries. So we pay for it. We pay for it in so many ways. We pay for it financially. It's our taxes that pay. In the UK, somewhere between 2 and 4 billion to prop up prohibition, creating costs estimated by the Home Office at 15 billion a year. So we're spending between 2 and 4 to create costs of 15. That's not good value for money. But we pay in all the other ways. Our privacy is invaded, dirty drugs. There's the opportunity cost of spending all that time on enforcement that then isn't spent on social care, on virtually anything else other than fighting the war on drugs, because you'd be literally better off burning the money than you would spending it on the war on drugs. It's that catastrophic. But we also benefit from it. There is a mean which we have collectively bought, which is that the war on drugs protects us. So we have a feeling of going to bed feeling safer in our beds collectively, and we can look at this in the polling. Collectively, we would rather have the war on drugs in place than not. It's an easy way of feeling better about walking the streets. The cops will look after us. And it's too hard in many ways for people to contemplate the fact that for 50 or 60 years we've been operating a policy that actually puts us all in danger and that we need a fundamental shift. So it's tough when you're in an environment where the state and the government control a lot of the messaging around this, where people are effectively duped into supporting the policy. So we actually feel like it's benefiting us when it clearly is not. I've actually left out, I've missed out government here. Governments clearly aren't going to change unless there is a significant change in electoral support. We keep voting collectively for prohibition. The Labour Party and the Tory Party are both prohibitionist parties, and we keep voting them in. So in that sense, We are actively supporting the status quo. And they're not going to change unless and until people begin to vote a different way. So that's fairly depressing. These 5 major forces holding everything in place. It'd be odd if I came here to say it's all about to change, everything's going our way. It clearly isn't. It isn't. Prohibition is still pretty locked in place, although it is, and I'll come on to this, getting increasingly fragile. So why will things change? I still believe, when I set up in 96, my take was that we could effectively make ourselves redundant as a campaign by 2020. Now, I still believe that to be the case. Now, given the depressing picture I've just painted, why am I that deluded? Let me tell you. Let's look at those 5 forces. Let's leave aside nature for the moment, although I'll bring that in very quickly at the end. Given that this is a state-led initiative, we know it's a state-led initiative because whoever you vote for, you get prohibition. It must be an edifice that sits behind democratically elected parties. And it also relates, as I said earlier, to the application of monopoly violence. And governments don't get to do that, states do. So why would the state give up on this, given that it is an opportunity for social control domestically and in terms of foreign policy? One word, blowback. The vast proportions of the criminal market, which are valued by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime at around $350 billion a year, every year, it's one of the largest commodity trades on earth, puts armed, non-state actors, organised criminal groups, in a position where they can compete in terms of wealth and firepower for that monopoly violence. And that's what goes on in Colombia, in Peru, in Mexico, in Afghanistan. So what you have is a state of blowback, where a state-led initiative has actually created a criminal opportunity so vast that it creates a significant opportunity for non-state actors to compete with it. Now that's problematic, because even if the state doesn't care about us, they do care about themselves. And to have states toppling, particularly big states, like, Mali, not a hegemon, not a major superpower, but Mali was assessed to be a fairly well-functioning African state. And it is in real trouble now since the drug trade shifted in there. And the wealth and firepower of non-state actors there, who are also working with terror groups there and providing money for them, or at least the terror groups can tax them and get the money to support their activities. That's a real problem. And that's happening in many parts of the world. So that could be a key reason why the war on drugs ends. Not because everybody buys the fact that drugs are actually fairly beneficial in many ways, and that we need to move to a different paradigm for all kinds of very good reasons. It may well just be that it's so destructive for the state that it falls that way. In terms of capitalism, capitalism will only change. Major capital institutions of capital will only shift if the political risk around investment becomes too high. Now, even in Mexico, where 100,000 people have killed each other in turf wars in the last 5 years, Mexico is still seen as a good place to invest. So it's difficult to see how bad things could get before capital begins to flee conflict zones created by the war on drugs. Now, here's an interesting one in terms of the way that the citizens relate to the state, because things are changing in the world. Now I'm going to move on to something a little more positive. 4 US states and the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis. It's one of the few places in the world where citizenry has direct access to the legislature. And where they've gone, bollocks to prohibition, we'll go for legalization, thanks very much. And interestingly, it would be interesting if we had that in the UK, because the polling shows that we are now in a majority in terms of support for reform here and in many other places. And it is only that lack of access, direct access to the legislature that stops that. So citizens are continuing to build support for reform. The other one is that one of the reasons why the war on drugs can be set up the way that it is by setting up drugs and the people who use them, produce them and supply them as a threat. And in order to do that, those people, them, they have to be the other. That's the way that security is created. It's us against them and us protecting ourselves against them. Now the problem with drugs is it's us. The idiocy, the lunacy, and the synchronicity, really, of the timing of the international war on drugs was that it began with the Single Convention in 1961. There were quite a lot of other things going on in the 60s, one of which was a lot of new drug use. The drug subculture really took off in the 60s. So you had this collision, and at that point we knew that if it continued, that them was going to become us. And it is very much us. Loads of people still use drugs, will continue to, and that idea that it's somebody else who uses drugs, and particularly in the case where both Barack Obama and David Cameron are both former illegal drug users. So it's there very much at the very top of that elite tree. It's very hard to maintain the meme of them against us when it actually just is us. So change is happening, despite the fact that those major forces of power are holding things in place. And I just wanted to finish with an appeal to those of you who aren't currently involved in drug policy reform to get involved. There are loads of places that you can. You can go and visit us, Transform on the web. There are loads of other campaigning organisations all over the world that provide opportunities to learn about this thing, to learn how to articulate it, and how best we might go about ending it sooner rather than later. I still think 2020 is a realistic goal, but it will only be as realistic as I think it is if we all get behind ending the lunacy of the war on drugs and replacing it with an effective, legal, government-controlled system of regulation. Thank you.